But if you now come back all the way to your question in the beginning, like what now determines something as wholesome and what determines something as unwholesome, well, that is fully up to you discerning whether your mind is pressuring you. And that will be an internal criteria. And so even if the whole world says, wait, what you just did there is wrong, if you know that it wasn't coming out of your mind pressuring you, then from the point of view of Dhamma, it will for you not have been wrong.
Yesterday, when we were together, you mentioned just briefly about right and wrong. About something being right or wrong is quite black or white. I was just curious about what the criteria is for something that's right or wrong, and I just want to kind of maybe just clarify, as far as I see it, the definition of right is more to do with it not being wrong. That most of the descriptions in the suttas, for example, are more that kind of negative. It's not this or not that. And it kind of seems that the rightness is more about what you're left with once you've removed these kind of wrong views. So to establish the right view. I'm just curious if that's seems correct, or if there is actually something more substantial there. Yeah.
Well, let's find out. Yeah, so we were talking about yesterday about what makes something wholesome and what makes something unwholesome. Now, perhaps to start, there is this famous Ovada Patimokkha verses by the Buddha, and there he starts out by saying, refraining from what is unwholesome, and then it says, doing what is wholesome. And that particular order there is already significant. So it starts by seeing and understanding what is unwholesome. And by then gradually understanding that more and more, like recognizing unwholesome as unwholesome, which has got various layers of subtlety to it, you will discern that principle and move towards an understanding of what is wholesome. So in your question, you're basically right. You come upon that which is wholesome by understanding what is unwholesome. And you can see that in the gradual training also, which begins with the virtue, which is all about starting out by not doing certain things, which you might have to take on faith from the beginning. Might not be completely clear what's now wrong with these things. I mean, killing and stealing is right. The moral precepts are obviously clear, but beyond that, what constitutes something as unwholesome? That's now the question, right? So, in your own experience, how do you know whether a certain action, by body, speech, or mind, is wholesome and is unwholesome and should therefore be avoided? What is the criteria? Are you just going to stick to the external rules, to the formulations that you have as a monk? Or if you're a layperson, you're keeping a certain number of precepts, you just keep that externally, you understand what is within the rule and what is not within the rule, so you just keep the rules and everything else is automatically fine? Or is there a more fundamental criteria that determines something as unwholesome? What would you say?
Well, you would need to start by holding them externally.
Mm-hmm.
So that, because like I've heard many times, a kind of definition of what might be unwholesome. But to think that, or you could just look into the suttas right now and find a definition of what is unwholesome, what is a more precise criteria for the answer to the question. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can find that in your experience or know that in your experience.
Okay.
Right from the start.
Yeah, but then
Yeah.
what do the suttas say is unwholesome?
Well, acting out of greed, hatred, and delusion as a kind of standard.
As a kind of standard.
Yeah.
Of course, that's a textual answer,
yes.
which is not wrong, but in a sense, everybody can say that.
Yes.
So, okay.
So then, in your experience of holding those precepts, then it would be about discerning why those things are acting out of greed, hatred, and delusion.
Yeah. So
and gradually coming closer and closer to understanding what is unwholesome.
Yes, understanding what falls within greed, hatred, and delusion. Now, in your own experience, can you describe what would make greed, hatred, and let's say middle-mindedness or delusion, what those three have in common, so that you can say, wait, that's the wrong direction, that is decline, that is deteriorating away from Dhamma, and so on. What would that be? What constitutes something as greed, as hatred, or as middle-mindedness? All the way from the most coarse to the most subtle.
Well, there is a bunch of things, but one of them is like loss of perspective. Like I just get totally caught in like my thought, the object of the senses, or like whatever is pressuring me at that moment. And there is like a pressure to go in that direction. Like it feels like I have to go there because otherwise I feel like the pressure is felt again. It seems like if I don't go there, I will suffer. It seems like that. It seems that if I'm not acting out of like those things that pressure me, if I don't go in that direction of where they pressure me, I'm going to suffer. It feels like the natural way of like going out of that, and those kind of things make me totally lose perspective and lose the context of my situation. Like I lose the sense of what's going on, really.
Yeah, so what is the factor there in all of this that you just described? What is the factor based on which you can say this is unwholesome? Because losing yourself in senses and not having perspective, all of that is already in a sense the result of going in that wrong direction. So if you wanna let's say go upstream, so to speak, and you want to find out which phenomena in your experience determines unwholesome as unwholesome. Well, how would you describe that?
I guess it's felt as a unpleasant pressure, and that pressure is there because of you craving. It wouldn't necessarily be that obvious. Yeah.
But are you sure this is it?
Craving. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And craving manifests as pressure. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just asking.
I wouldn't say. I'm not sure if it manifests as pressure.
But that pressure is there.
Yes, exactly.
Good. So you find that pressure is there. Then
if it was that pressure, then I think it would be much easier to kind of untangle yourself or realize that you're craving and so on.
But what if it is that pressure? what if acting out of the pressure is the determining factor for unwholesome? Even if the whole world says it's fine, there's no problem with it, you can do it, but you clearly see, wait, my mind is just pushing me now.
The pressure is not necessarily in your control.
Well,
so
we can go into that.
Then I wouldn't be able to free myself.
Wait, okay, but now that's a bit of a jump.
Okay.
We're just first finding out, so there's the pressure,
yeah.
Right? Now, what if you don't act out of that pressure? You're aware that your mind is pushing you in a certain direction, pressuring you.
Yeah.
You recognize the pressure, and you make sure that you're not acting out of it by body, speech, and by mind. Are you then doing anything unwholesome? No. That's right. Even though that pressure is there.
Yeah, right.
So, the unwholesome action, which is always on you, starts when you are acting out of that pressure. And it's now important to realize that, in fact, your mind cannot force you to do certain things. You will always be there, giving in, and going along with the pressure. And that is eventually how you come to recognize the safety from unwholesome, because precisely because it's always up to you, you can develop yourself so as to not give in to the pressure. So that even in the face of pressure, you will not be doing anything unwholesome. Which is why we often talk about the importance of having that attitude of responsibility. And fundamentally, that is what the right view then boils down to. It is seeing beyond doubt what is your responsibility and what isn't. So, acting out by body, speech and mind of that pressure is what constitutes unwholesome action, but not the mere presence of the pressure. But if you now overshoot it and say, well, I don't want to have that pressure, you would just go the other extreme and you now start basically attacking your own mind, assuming that it shouldn't be pressured, that you don't want to be pressured, which is ironically now you acting out of ill will towards your own mind. That is why we often speak about right endurance, that pressure is there, which is in a sense, well, it's not directly of your making, it's there due to stuff that you've done in the past, but now you are stuck with it. So then you just have to endure it and clearly see the distinction. Wait, this is mind pressuring me, and now it's up to me whether I act out of that pressure or not. And in order to get that distinction clear, that is precisely the perspective upon your situation. And so if there is pressure, you cannot fundamentally not do things. So then the wisdom is in learning, can I do things while that pressure is there that are not, let's say, coming out of that pressure.
Right. Another thing recently I found helpful was not when the mind's pressured and you know you should really restrain this tendency to act out. Even if it's not breaking the precepts or seems quite remote, like kind of what you said, like beyond the scope of the precepts, kind of seems like that. Just not seeing any pressure as outside the scope of the precepts, in a sense. If that makes sense. So that because that thread is the same, and that if you feed the mind now, then and you keep going in that same direction, then eventually you would break the precepts. Even if it's going for a walk or muddling with or getting tangled up with doubt. It's still the same trajectory. So it's a fault of, it's a kind of, I don't know. Is that what I would do?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I follow, but if by keeping the precepts, look, the whole point of keeping those precepts is for you to even begin to recognize what it means to be pressured by the mind. Right? Because the starting point is you'll just be running with it, so you don't even see it. Then you have various good reasons for keeping the precepts. You keep them, and so at some point your mind wants to push you in that direction, but now you, being committed to those precepts, say, wait, I don't want to go there. So there's going to be somewhat of an internal, quote-unquote, conflict between your mind pushing you in one direction, and then at some point you run against that fence, which is those precepts that you're keeping. Now, those precepts, they are in your welfare if you don't break them, but more fundamentally, their point is that when you run in the fence, you want to say, wait, why am I even running in this direction? And so you turn around and you see, aha, it was basically my mind pressuring me. And that begins with those 8 precepts. And then getting that principle, you want to refine it more and more so that you see more clearly your mind pressuring you. That's the whole point of those precepts. And that example that you mentioned with that monk who is just not doing anything unwholesome about body, speech and mind, if you see to that degree, with such clarity, your own mind and whether it pressures you or not, then you don't need any of those rules. You can just not act. Then anything that comes out of that pressure will be unwholesome and you don't do it. But then, of course, you should be quite clear. So when the Buddha asked that monk, do you see that? Then basically that monk is declaring himself to the Buddha to be a noble disciple because, Sariputta, when he was asked in the Samadhi Sutta, how do you know what is the right view? Then the first thing Sariputta mentions is, well, here a noble disciple knows the wholesome and the root of the wholesome, and the unwholesome and the root of the unwholesome. This is how someone is of the right view. So when the Buddha then asked that particular monk, do you see unwholesome as unwholesome? And if he then says fully, yes, I see all of that to the point that I can train and not doing anything unwholesome, he was basically already having the right view, so then he was on that middle way, he has understood that principle, okay, then just develop it. But we should not be taking any liberties. It's better to be on the safe side, start with those precepts, and then as we discussed now earlier, within those boundaries you begin to refine it, but at the end of the day it is between you and your mind. And when that relationship is fully clear, mind pressuring you. And we can say that greed, hatred and illusion or hindrances are just particular manifestations of the same pressure. That's what they all have in common. That relationship you want to fully clear up, and then you do not depend on anyone in the world, anything external, quote unquote, to tell you what's right and wrong. Because the only criteria for whether you now do something or not is whether your own mind is pressuring you in that direction, which is unwholesome, or whether it's not. And then there's no issue with it. And then wherever you are, you keeping an eye on what that own mind is doing, whether it is pressuring you or not, you will be able to practice in every situation regardless. Now it's then still better to be in seclusion because it will be much more easy to recognize these things. So if you sleep a lot, if you have a lot of duties, people around, work to do, talking and so on, you eat too much, you become sleepy, right? Then that will all be an impediment to keeping an eye on what that chitta is up to. But the whole principle of wholesome and the root of the wholesome, and the unwholesome and the root of the unwholesome, boils down to that. But in order to even begin to see what is going on, you need to start by keeping those precepts, and then the gradual training also says sense restraint, because to even discern what that mind is up to, that is in a sense in the opposite direction of being now lost in the world of the senses. That mind will always be peripheral, and so you cannot attend to it directly, right? This is all the talks about peripheral awareness, seeing it indirectly and so on. What you see directly will always be object of senses, which is why sense restraint, so not losing the perspective and just being lost in objects, but bringing it back sort of here, quote unquote, will be necessary, because if you're just lost that way, you're not really going to see what that mind is doing. And of course it's that same mind pushing you to be lost there, so that it stays out of sight, which is how it has maximum control over you. So if you want to keep an eye on it so that you are not the slave of your own mind, but your mind becomes your best ally, you have to first pull yourself out from being lost in the domain of the senses. which is why after the basic virtue, which will already save you a lot of trouble, sense restraint will be the next thing. And the right development of Yoniso Manasikara is, of course, what's going to be the next step. Because acting out of hindrances and attending from the origin, that's mutually exclusive. So by understanding what Yoniso Manasikara is and developing that, you will be gaining a clearer perspective on what the hindrances are and what is pressuring you. But also, right, we've discussed that quite a few times, but just to keep the precepts and not act out and refine that principle that we started to talk about in the beginning is already developing that Yoniso direction, whether you call it that or not. But if you now come back all the way to your question in the beginning, like what now determines something as wholesome and what determines something as unwholesome, well, that is fully up to you discerning whether your mind is pressuring you. And that will be an internal criteria. And so even if the whole world says, wait, what you just did there is wrong, if you know that it wasn't coming out of your mind pressuring you, then from the point of view of Dhamma, it will for you not have been wrong. That's kind of amazing.
Yeah. At the beginning it's threatening, and then it becomes...
Well, because true freedom is in the beginning very threatening.
Yeah.
And that sense of independence. And they go together, right? Freedom, responsibility, all those things, they're just different facets of the same thing. So to say that you are fully responsible for everything you do by body, speech and mind, that statement has got meaning only if you see that in relation to your mind pressuring you. If you leave that whole domain out, then you can say, yeah, I take responsibility for what I do, but that would just be a hollow statement if in reality it is your mind pushing you in this and that direction. Then it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, because it's like, oh, I'm responsible, but I don't have the choice but to react to that pressure. So it's like, well, then you're not responsible at all.
Yeah, so then you can say I'm responsible, but that's just a joke then.
Yeah.
So you have to include that, and then start training and taming that mind, so that then at some point you will be able to start telling that mind what to do. Right? In the beginning it's going to be a bit of a struggle. You have to tame and train that mind, and it might not immediately listen. That is why you need to be patient and so on. But at some point that mind begins to trust you. You can see, wait, mind begins to tame, that relationship develops, and you begin to realize that the safety is in your mind not being able to make you do things without you giving in. So it is fully up to you. And then you realize, well, then the whole training is to train that mind so that it is no longer pressuring me in unwholesome directions, but it will see for itself that it is much better if it calms down, and then you can just live happily together and your mind will be your ally, rather than something that you need to keep an eye on, because if you don't, you end up being in trouble.
Is that freedom from remorse? That kind of... Because it's an aspect of it, not the whole thing.
Yeah, so why are you in remorse about things? What does the remorse depend upon?
Or giving in to the pressure.
And then on a later occasion realizing, wait, that's not right.
Yeah, knowing it's not right.
So there has to be some loss of perspective somewhere.
Yeah.
And then afterwards you sort of regain it and you say, well, that was now not good. So that is even more reason to keep an eye on that mind.
Sort of what you thought was a form of safety clearly wasn't a form of safety.
Yeah, so that remorse can then also be a clear indicator that there's more work to be done. That is why it is good to keep questioning. And even in the sutras, for noble disciples, that is a recurring training. Like, can my companions find fault with my conduct? And even that is then just in relation to external things, to stuff that other people can see. Even that is still a reflection there. Then how much more so you in relation to your own thoughts that you might still be delighting in and welcoming.
that was something I'd been interested in, because there's actually quite a lot in the suttas, and definitely a lot in the Vinaya, that is clearly aiming at removing social remorse, a kind of remorse that might come from quite arbitrary things, like just about how your etiquette or how a monk should walk, and there's a lot of advice on that, which doesn't necessarily. If you just had that, you wouldn't necessarily be pointed in the right direction of your intention.
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure which ones you are now referring to, but sure. So that there is a level of etiquette, and okay, then you don't maybe want to be misrepresenting other monks with certain behaviors. But you see, then fundamentally still,
it seems like it would still be beneficial, otherwise it wouldn't be there. I mean, like even if it's
so you can take that on, consider it, put it into practice. But again, now don't just regard that now as external, but you can still try to see like could there be something unwholesome about those things still? Like would there be some restlessness in the mind or something else that is not proper for somebody who is like fully composed and self-controlled, right? If you walk down the street on arms round and you are just window shopping, right? Just looking at what's on sale, it's going to be very difficult. If you still have interest in those things, you're sort of missing the point in terms of your overall perspective.
Yeah.
Or if you are talking loudly, or you're just laughing and joking, then all of that, perhaps not too complicated to see that, if you want to train yourself on the level of which thoughts you are welcoming and not welcoming, but then outwardly you are laughing and joking to the point that other people in the street actually, you draw attention from those people. Well, you cannot be behaving in that way and at the same time keep an eye on what's going on mentally. So that's the same reason why seclusion is beneficial. You don't need to talk to anyone, and if you do not need to talk and break out into speech, it will be much easier to see your mental chatter. It's not so easy to see your mental chatter when you're talking the whole time. You don't see it, and in fact, because just to break out into speech and say something can, of course, also come out of that same pressure from the mind. So that's the same training. Should I now say it or not? And we did a whole talk on right speech in the past, and it's that same principle. Whether something is wholesome or unwholesome is not determined by what you say, but by the intention based on which you say it. And if you feel pressure to say something, then that is what makes it unwholesome, not the words that you are saying. Even though in the sutras there are then indications like, okay, if your speech goes in this direction, it will always be wrong. Just as in the beginning, breaking precepts will always be wrong. You cannot justify breaking those precepts and then say, there wasn't any pressure. That's impossible. So those outer boundaries are there just to show you the main principle, and then it's up to you, like, okay, now develop that same principle that is now coming into sight on account of you being committed to those precepts, body and speech. And then you just fully apply it to the mental level as well. And that just takes, that is training. And that takes also reviewing, and it's good to just make time for that at the end of the day and consider which conversation did I have, what did I talk about, do I still recollect acting out of pressure, and to just get in the habit of reflecting in that way, and then it will be, over time it will become easier to catch yourself while you are in that situation, because that is fundamentally where the restraint then needs to happen.
Yeah, I think to go back to the remorse and what you say now is that this practice of what we just mentioned, like kind of recollecting what kind of action, what kind of speech, and eventually what kind of thought and kind of was cultivating during the day is like basically to kind of cultivate a sense of shame, like cultivate the right sense of shame. And remorse doesn't happen automatically. It's just kind of like forgetting literally this very sense of shame. Because like if I was shameful enough, this action I will have actually avoid. And basically like now I'm ashamed of having lacking my enough shame. So I just act out of like shamelessness really, and I just act out on those ways. And that's why it feels like difficult, because now I have to kind of recollect and feel that shame. It has to be felt, like, and that's painful, and it has to be felt like without trying to get rid of it or certainly not justifying it, just like kind of feeling it and take the determination to say, okay, next time I won't do it, but now I did, so I have to endure the things. And I think that's why it's very, like, those practices are so beneficial, but at the same time, kind of hard, like, because you have to kind of endure the things over and over again. And like this attitude of like justifying the mind trying to find justification and things like that, it seems much more easy, but that's the very reason why, because I was justifying myself, that's the very reason why I give to those actions that now I feel shameful of. So like I think it kind of also follow like what you were saying before, like it's black and white, you cannot do both at the same time. Whether I kind of cultivate this sense of shame, or I just that's okay, that's alright.
You either cover it, you're either covering it, or you are learning to
and that is also why it's for a noble disciple, that's one of the first faculties that the Buddha often talks about, shame, and the right shame based on the correct understanding, and now the fear of wrongdoing, right? Fear of wrongdoing, like not wanting to now start agitating that mind that you basically were taming. So that's good, and it even says in the context of monks and their precepts, like even if you break one of those precepts, I mean it's better to not do that, but if you let's say break one of those precepts, then to correct them, well, to realize that you made a mistake, confess it, correct it, and then determine to not do it again. And then the Buddha says, this is how there is progress in Dhamma. Basically, just what you described. Now, that whole same principle applies even if you do not break any of the precepts that have been formulated. But as we said, at some point, you want to keep that same attitude until even on the level of the thoughts that you welcome and delight in, or the things that you anticipate, at some point, it will come to that. And then you say, wait, I don't want to delight in it, I don't want to welcome it. And then there are certain discourses that deal with how to remove obstructing thoughts, and that's going to be a whole separate discussion, like, because thoughts can arise on their own, so you have to endure, but at some point you will also recognize, wait, I'm actually now feeding those thoughts, and that you should stop. And we can call it thought, but there's there's further development there, but we can discuss that perhaps on another occasion. But all of that will depend on understanding what we are saying now, because it's essentially for the mind not different than when you start with the precepts for the body and speech, which is why it's a gradual training.